today, in an age of rapid innovation, big customers, professional procurement, and shifting markets, pricing is harder than it's ever been before. And that's true whether you're a product manufacturer, service provider, or a software company. I think software in particular, though, has some unique characteristics that make pricing both more challenging and just different. For example, one of the fundamental characteristics of most software products is that you have very high gross margins relative to some other types of business. Now that's not a bad thing, but high gross margins makes discounting both attractive and easier to do, and therefore it makes it very easy for us to make pricing flexible, to train customers that they can earn discounts when just by being aggressive or pushing hard for those discounts. And so it makes it a more challenging environment. Another thing is pricing in software is more complex. If no other reason, just the pricing models around the subscriptions and licensing models, it's much more difficult, and there's much more to think about and many more factors to consider than, say, if you're pricing plumbing fixtures. And I think another thing that makes pricing in software particularly unique but also different is the sort of continuous and rapid development cycle. It means that value propositions are constantly changing, both yours and your competition, and it makes finding the right price an exercise in hitting the moving target. And so we could go on with the list, but the point being it's worthwhile to spend a little bit of time and think about some of those things that make pricing both in software both challenging and different. Now, we're not going to be able to sort through all of these issues in one 45-minute webinar. For reference, I used to teach a course at the University of Chicago that lasted 5 days. So rather than talk really fast and try to cover a lot of ground, we're going to focus on a number of really key issues. Specifically, what we're going to try to do is 3 things in the webinar. One of the things is point out the top 5 sort of missed pricing opportunities that we see in software. We've been fortunate enough to have a lot of background in software, but have been fortunate enough to spend a fair amount of time with a large number of the Insight portfolio companies. And these are the types of problems that are resonating for folks across the board. But more than that, rather than just point out the problems, we want to give you a few simple, relatively easy to execute diagnostic tests you can run to see if those opportunities are relevant for you. And then finally, with the idea and the spirit of making this practical and useful, we're going to give you a few practical steps that you can start to put to work at the end of this webinar to start to close some of the gaps that you identified earlier on. So, with no further ado, let's dive in. So let's talk about the top 5 mispricing opportunities in software. The first one I want to bring up here goes back to this issue of the pricing model, and is having in the pricing model, one of the key components is price metrics. And the problem with having price metrics be sort of not right, if you will, is that it really can limit opportunities for revenue growth, and it can certainly, which then encourages and spurs on excessive discounting. So, for example, one of the things that will often happen if you've got a metric that's misaligned is that you'll see customers with, say, if you're running a seat-based license, you'll see customers with a limited number of users, but users who are, for example, very high value, that they get a tremendous amount of value out of the product. You'll see them start to be mispriced, and you'll start to have the pricing will be too high for them. So that's an example. One example, we worked with a data and analytics provider who sold critical information about energy production and usage to companies and to traders. So they had 2 different segments. Now the traders really didn't have a lot of seats, but what they did have, and this company used a seat-based license, what they did have was they were on that on the product, on the software constantly, dipping into it every hour, looking for information. The information was critical to their trading practices, so it was extremely high value. But because there were fewer numbers of traders, their prices tended to be a little lower under a seat-based metric. Now, conversely, you had companies who used the product more as a reference tool. They would dip into it periodically. It was more for planning purposes. And so their price, but they had a larger number of users. And so for that company, the prices tended to be relatively too high. So the challenge were relatively too low. So the challenge was, how do you reconcile figure out what that right price metric might be that aligns price with the value created? So that's one. Number 4 is complex pricing. And this is something we have seen in a number of the portfolio companies in Insight, but it's a common problem across many software companies. Complex pricing, it confuses customers, it increases the sales cycle. In fact, that's actually one of the big symptoms of complex pricing, is if you start to see the sales cycles getting long, or you're getting feedback that they're having a hard time sorting through the pricing and the offer, it's an indication that your pricing may be overly complex. Now, number 3 is around unmanaged discounts. Now, one of the challenges with discounts is that it is such a powerful lever at the point of sale to close the deal. And so without very clear pricing policies and very clear sort of metrics to track discounts, what we frequently see is no matter what the strategy was, no matter what the pricing intent going in was, as soon as you hit procurement or you start to hit pushback from the customers, it becomes an exercise in negotiation. Every deal becomes strategic, and therefore you start to see really widely varying prices, net prices coming down the pipe. This creates confusion for customers. It leaves them wondering whether they really got a good value or if they should have pushed harder. Essentially starts to train them to push harder and negotiate more effectively against you. And so it's certainly a problem both from a profitability standpoint, but it creates a market dynamic that becomes increasingly challenging. Okay. The next one is around poorly targeted offers. And you may think that it seems odd if we're talking about pricing but we're talking about poorly targeted offers. But in fact, the number of offers, the offers you have in the market, is the foundation for your pricing. And it's the way that you can price differently, one of the key ways you can price differently to different segments in the marketplace. For example, and there can be a number of problems here that we'll talk about a little later in the webinar. Your price, you may have too simple or too few of offers. For example, we worked with one software HR outsourcing solution provider who had a one-size-fits-all offer, but had really different, clearly distinct segments in the market. They had sort of mom and pops, stores and companies that had a small number of employees, relatively unsophisticated, didn't need a lot of functionality, all the way up to enterprise customers who needed, extra functionality. And so they were always under stress and always mispriced for those offers, for those across those two segments. So getting those offers right is the foundation to a really solid pricing strategy, which brings us to the number 1 problem in missed opportunity, which is just getting the price right. Most software markets, pricing and value is highly dynamic, and therefore just trying to get a read and figure out what data to pay attention to. Should I be looking at my competitors' pricing? Should I be thinking about value? Do I believe what procurement's telling me? So how do I get the price right and manage that in a systematic way over time? Now, we're not going to have time to do all of these, to cover all of these in the webinar, so we're going to focus on the first 2, getting the price right and poorly targeted offers. So let's talk about managing price levels. There's really, like I said, pricing is a big topic, and trying to figure out what the right price level is really challenging because there's so much data to pay attention to. Most of you have voice of the customer data. We certainly have profitability data. You're looking at retention and conversion analytics. We've got competitors' pricing. And so what happens for a lot of companies is you try to sift through all those things. You don't have a systematic way for figuring out what the right price should be, and therefore you end up either weighing it or paying attention to one or only two of those factors, matching competitors, pricing, etc. So what we're going to talk about today is three things. One is, how do I just do a quick check on my price levels to see if they're approximately right? And that's really the goal here. We're not worried about being precisely right. We want to be approximately right and not precisely wrong. So the first thing is, how do I decide if I'm in the right ballpark? Second is, how do I make price adjustments? And in the process of doing that, what is the best practice for raising a price, for example? And then finally, how do I manage risk? Changing price can be relatively low risk if it's a small price increase for a high value segment, or it can be quite a substantial endeavor if you're changing a price metric, you're raising prices substantially because you haven't been doing that for the last couple of years. So how do I manage risk? So I want to touch on each of those three topics. So first off, let's just lay the groundwork. What are the benchmarks for trying to decide where our pricing is and where it ought to be? There's a lot of things to consider. If you look over the right-hand side of the screen, you can think about customer value. You can think about your business objectives. Are you in a growth mode versus in a more mature market where you're trying to really drive margins? What are those margins? And do you have more for some segments than for others? And what's the competition doing? Where we start, and the ultimate anchor, is going to be customer value. And we've got a very simple model on the left-hand side. Simple but powerful. If you think about customer value, and we've worked with some of your sales folks, we know that it's very common. You guys are very comfortable doing value propositions. So if you think about customer value, there's really two components. One is the reference value, which is actually the price of your competition. So we're already bringing in competitive pricing as when we use a value-based approach here. So we start with the pricing of your competitor's products. Now you may not know exactly what that is, but you should have some ideas of where their pricing falls if you're going up against them. And then the next part of that is, how much differential value do you bring? And when we talk about value, what we're really talking about is the dollars and cents or euros or yen or whatever amount of currency, the amount of costs you reduce or the revenues you increase by buying your product relative to the competition. So if we can begin to think about that net differential value in a quantified way, now that gives us a way to start to think about where price should fall. Now, it could fall anywhere in that window, that net differential value window. It could fall outside of that window, but very rarely is that going to be a smart move. On occasion, but rarely. So the question is, where in that window should I fall? Should I be higher? Should I be lower? So let's take a look at some ways to start to get our arms around that and think about that question. So a couple things. How do you know, the first sort of little diagnostic test, whether you're underpricing or overpricing is, you can just look at your situation. You might be underpricing if you avoid annual price bumps. Now, if you're an inside portfolio company, I know you're encouraged not to do that. But if you are sort of been hesitant or not pushing on annual price bumps, it's possible you're underpricing, but not certain. If you haven't raised price in fill-in-the-blank years, again, probably not a case for most of you here, but if you've been slow or you've not had a regular price increase cadence, might be a symptom that you're underpricing. One of the key things, and this goes back to value without actually doing a calculation, is if you're priced lower than the competitors, even when your products are better, that's a real sign you may be underpricing. We'll talk a little bit more about that. And if your margins are stagnant or declining. Now, having stagnant or declining margins is not a definitive thing that says you're underpricing, but it's certainly a possibility. You can think about it on the overpricing side, and I'll just quickly move through these. You may be overpricing if your competition has closed the gap on the product side, just release new products or change their pricing. Value is relative to the competition always. If your competition has changed their value prop or changed their prices, your value has changed, and it might be an example of where you could be slightly overpriced. If your customer's business is changing rapidly, if they're starting, their cost structures are changing, if they're outsourcing, it's a sign that the value of your offer may be different than it was when you first engaged with them. sign you might be overpricing. If you have unexplained pockets of low conversion or retention, another sign. Or if growth is stagnant or declining, similar sign that you might be overpricing. So those are high-level things, not that diagnostic. Let's give you 2 or 3 other easy-to-use tools, and we'll go from left to right here. And with the increasing complexity in sort of amount of labor that you need to do, none of them are particularly onerous, and you're probably doing some of these already today. So the first one on the left is break-even analysis. And this is a simple little calculation that will at least give you some directional guidance of whether a price increase or a price decrease looks attractive. And it's something you can do on the back of an envelope. You can do as you're having a conversation with the salesperson to give you a quick read of the basic economics. We can go a step further and say, if you've got some questions, your competitor has changed price, we can do a simple price value analysis, which is build a fairly straightforward, fairly simple value model, and let's see where in that window, that pricing window, that you fall. And then all of you doing conversion retention analytics of some sort. What we can do is show you a couple ways to dig in a little deeper and use those analytics to help you understand where you may have some pockets of pricing opportunities. And I'll give you a good example of that when we get to that. So let's start with break-even formula. Okay, those of you who are not mathematically inclined, don't panic. This is a relatively simple formula, and I'll tell you, it's probably 30+ years old. So it's been around a long time, and it was really designed for more of a product-based world, but it's still quite useful even in software. Formula goes like this. The percent change, break-even sales change, which is the amount of change that if you were increasing price, it's the amount of volume you could afford to lose before that price increase was no longer profitable. Okay, formula is simple. It's the negative of the change in price, the delta P, divided by the contribution margin plus delta P. This is simple analytic. The big weakness of this analytic is that it does not account for churn. So it's not thinking about customer lifetime value. It's just sort of an in-the-moment, quick and easy tool to use. I'll show you a couple examples of what that calculation might look like. One thing I would point out here, contribution margin, which is defined as price minus variable cost, that can be a flexible concept. And variable cost, you can get the finance people debating the definition and the nature of variable cost for endless hours. We're going to kind of avoid that. What we're really looking for is things that are truly variable. And again, this is just a quick read tool, so the key is not to overcomplicate it. So let's just take a look at how this tool could be useful. So if we did it, we're looking at a price cut. So the way I typically use this is to say, hey, I'm thinking about a price cut. I think I might be overpriced, and some of those symptoms we were just talking about are in effect. What's the economics of a 10% price cut? Well, let's suppose you have a 70% contribution margin. That's actually the contribution margin is the driver of your pricing economics. So you've got a 20%, a 10%, 70% contribution margin, and you're looking at a 10% price cut. What the formula will tell you is that you could afford to lose up to 16%. I mean, you would be required to gain more than 16.7% of your volume in order to maintain your current level of profitability, okay, for a 10% cut. Now, what's interesting, if you look at that, it's not a linear function. So if you increase the price by 20%, you would have to gain more than 40% in revenues. So as you look at that and you say, how would I use that? It's simple. You're having a discussion about changing price. The question becomes, do I think I can gain more than 16.7% in volume for a 10% price cut? Now, it doesn't tell you whether you should or shouldn't do the price cut, but it gives you at least a reference point to start to evaluate it. Similarly, we can do the same thing with price increase. The economics and the sign of the coefficient is different. But if you look at a 10% price increase with a 70% contribution margin, you could afford to lose up to 12.5% of your volume before you were less profitable before the price cut. So now this gets back to pricing strategy. If you're thinking about a significant price increase, one of the questions you want to ask is, do I think I'd lose more than 12.5% of my volume? Doesn't mean, if the answer is no, it doesn't mean you should do the price increase, but it does say that you would be more profitable. Okay, so simple tool, not hard to use. I often find it useful when I'm having a conversation with somebody in sales about a potential price cut or price change or a discount, to just run that calculation and say, hey, let's just reality check here. This is the economics. We may need to make this deal or make this price cut or this discount, but it's going to reduce our profitability, and here's sort of a read on how much. Now, let's talk about the second issue, the second tool, price and value modeling. Now, the good news is many, if not most, of the portfolio companies here are doing some kind of value proposition work. And again, what we were talking about when we talk about customer value is, starting on the left-hand side here, we start with a competitive reference price. And this simple value model, it's overly simplified, but this value model was for a hosted call center solution. So this is one of those sort of very sophisticated computerized systems that would recognize what you're asking, allows you, with using voice instead of sort of the punch button phone key, to figure out what you really need and get it right, and direct you to existing automated solutions. Or what it also, this solution was quite sophisticated. So it had stress detectors so that it could determine whether or not you're about to drop. It is a very sophisticated solution, but one of the values was it enabled users to automate more functions than they could have before. Now, it won't review the economics of call centers here on this webinar. That could be a bit of a snoozer, but if you look at this, the competitor had the competitor in this particular case had a much lower functionality product, and they were charging a lot less. They were charging 40 cents. Now, if you look at per minute, so if you look at the economics here, if you add the value of existing automation, which really came about by reducing the time that a live person had to tend to them, that was significant, 65 cents, and then being able to send them to new automation saved even more time, $1.26. Now, here's the interesting thing. They were priced at a 15% premium to the competition. Normally, without knowing anything else, you'd say, okay, that's probably not too bad. You're getting a premium over the competition, and we'll take that. But as you look at that 15%, that 46 cent price relative to the value, you start to realize customers getting a lot of value. We're not leaving price on the table. Well, we are potentially leaving price on the table. We're certainly giving away value. And the question then becomes, given what we know, given the nature of the market, should we be pricing, trying to capture a little more of that value? Now, what's great is this is another one that doesn't have to be an overly sophisticated, overly analytic exercise. So, for example, in this case, call center economics are well understood. It's something that people use all the time. You sort of look at the amount of labor per call center minute, how long typical calls are, what's the typical cost, multiply those together, you get the typical cost per rep, and then we understand what percentage of calls we can deflect automation, and it gets us to that calc. You can do this level of calculation pretty quickly, and I will tell you, it's one of the most valid and powerful reads on where you are in your pricing, and does your pricing make sense from a customer's perspective. Okay, so it's a really good reality check. Now, the last one, and I'm going to move through this example pretty quickly. Everybody on the call here is pretty experienced with using conversion and retention analytics. But I want to show you how we can go a little bit further to use them more effectively with pricing to help us understand our pricing opportunities. Now, obviously the name of this company is disguised, but Infoco was a provider of sort of very specialized market analytics for commodity markets in a wide number of markets, and they had a lot of different users. There's a very interesting mix of users who had very different use cases. They had producers, investment banks, traders, commodity buyers. So a lot of people were using this thing. And they really hadn't, they'd had a fairly static subscription model, and pricing hadn't changed a lot. They knew and they were confident they were underpriced, and they needed to find the opportunity to take price up. Where they got a little stuck was when they looked at the conversion analytics. They were looking at this and saying, oh, okay, look, we've got a group of customers where we must be overpriced because our conversion rate is really slow. So looking at those segments there, right? I won't identify them for sake of giving too much information away. But they looked at it and said, well, okay, that's great to know we've got customers we're overpriced for, but how in the world do we figure out a way to change their pricing? That's a big gap that looks like we have to close. So the key here, and this is the key of pricing, is to really dig down to the next level. And that's what they did for these particular segments. What they looked at was, in the second step, was what are the drivers? What might be drivers of why those customers might be using, get more or less value? And we also looked at a bunch of things in the sales process. In other words, is it driven by the salesperson? Are those the three groups of customers that are largely served by ineffective salespeople? What sector? What analytics? As we started to look at different factors and look at conversion rates within those segments, what we started to realize was the amount of trading was the key predictor of conversion rate. And those segments tended to be had low trading volume. So that led to a couple changes. It led to an evaluation of their price metrics to think of, gee, could we have some kind of combination of seat-based and usage-based metric? And it also led to some changes in the discount policies. Simple example here, but the point being is if you can start to dig deeper and understand what's driving conversion and retention based on proxies for value, usage, other factors that might give some insights into what's driving the retention or conversion problems, then you can begin to get to a reasonable and a thoughtful pricing solution. So one last thing, and then we're going to take a little break for questions here. But a couple principles. So, one of the things that I think you're being encouraged to do, and you should always be thinking about, is are we underpriced, and do we have a chance to more profitably take price up? And so one of the questions we always get is, how do I think about implementing a price increase? And I've been doing pricing for 25 years or so. And this was not in any textbook I ever studied or wrote, for that matter. But one of the things I've learned over the years is, as you're thinking about price increases, the number one factor to think about is it needs to be perceived to be fair from the customer's perspective. Now, I didn't say it actually has to be fair, but it needs to be perceived to be fair. So anytime we're making a price increase, we want to have a rationale for why it exists. That's why a lot of times we combine price increases with structural changes, if they're significant. Structural changes meaning, hey, we've got a new version, we've added new functionality, we've got higher value, it's better performance. Something that changes the value proposition gives you air cover to change the price. Now, you can't always do that. And if it's just an annual price increase, then that's okay. If it's an annual price increase, customers are trained to expect those, that's fine. If it's one of these situations, though, where you have to take a significant price increase, one of the key things is give fair warning and let customers plan for the change. Now, this isn't a software example, but one of the best known examples of that was Netflix. Netflix shifted over to their streaming service, and it was a very abrupt change. They didn't give people warning. They switched people over. They changed the pricing dramatically. It is a classic textbook case of how not to manage and make your price change feel more fair. And if it's a really substantial price increase, one of the things you can think about is rolling it out in stages. So that's one. Focus on fairness. Avoid across-the-board increases. Now, it's okay to increase price across the board, but what you want to start to think about is, gee, do I have certain segments where I might be overpriced, and I want to take a little less price there, and other segments where I might be underpriced, and I want to take more of my percent price increase in those segments. So be selectively aggressive. Where you've got opportunities, push harder. Where you've got higher risk, be a little more thoughtful. So understand those price volume trade-offs, use that break-even tool, use other tools to understand that, use your CLV models to help you get some insights into that, and be more thoughtful and more strategic about your price increases. And then finally, one of the things in many cases, you don't need to do market research, but if you do, if it feels like a high-risk move, make it quick and don't overinvest. One of the things you can do in negotiated businesses, go talk to sales, go talk to relationship account, get some feedback. In transactional businesses, where you have an opportunity to do an A/B test or a simple little pricing study, absolutely, those are not expensive and it's easy to do. So at that point, Rachel, I don't know, I've been talking probably too fast and covering a lot of ground. Did you have any questions from folks that you wanted to share?
Yeah, thanks, John, for all the insights so far. One question is, do you have a rule of thumb for how much it's safe to increase prices at any given time?
You know, it's not a rule of thumb. There's a couple of rules of thumb that I always pay attention to. You know, in some of those, it's more difficult today than it has been in the past. So, for example, one of the rules of thumb is people expect annual price increases in B2B markets, frankly, slightly above the inflation rate. They don't expect you to be below or at the inflation rate. Now, back in the days when the inflation rate was sort of a standard 3 to 4%, that made for very nice headroom. Even though inflation has been significantly less than that today, in most technology markets and for most B2B markets, the expectation is, you know, 3 to 5% is not out of line. And, you know, again, it partly depends upon things like, you know, have you been bringing new value, new functionality, but that's a pretty safe window in most markets for an annual price increase.
Great, thanks, John. I think we can move on to the next section.
Okay, because I think we may be running into time constraints. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about segmented offers or managing your offering structure. And let me do this. Let me sort of share with you a simple framework, and it's really simple, but it's really quite useful as you think about where your offers, you know, where your offers sort of land on a spectrum. So if you think about offers out there, you've got a spectrum. On the left-hand side, we've got the simplest of all. You've got a one-size-fits-all offer. You got one product, and that's what everybody's buying. You know, coming out of the gate early on in your, you know, your company life cycle, or for new products, this is pretty, you know, this is going to be standard. You've released the product. Now, the problem with the one-size-fits-all offer typically happens over time. What happens is you can often be, if you've got too simple a price structure, you may be, or offering structure, you may be overpriced for some low value or price sensitive customers. Okay, so you're going to end up seeing retention and conversion rates lower for those types of customers. Problem is not the price. The problem is you don't have the right offer for them. You don't have, the offer you have may have too much functionality. And similarly, at the high end, you may have some customers that are not getting the value that they need. One example of this was a company that came up with a very cool solution for doing market research, and it was in the healthcare industry. And what they had was they built a panel of physicians and other healthcare providers. Got this panel, and they gave them an app that a subscriber could submit a 3 or 4 question survey to them, shoot it out there, and get feedback within hours because it's on their phone. They're, you know, paid to respond quickly and get amazingly, you know, very quick reads on important questions. Great idea. Company was growing like a weed, but you can imagine what happened as companies really started to use these things, found them quite valuable, figured out that in market research got involved, for example, they started wanting more functionality. They wanted to be able to do programming within it. They wanted more questions. They actually wanted some consulting on how to ask certain questions based on the experience of the company. So the offering quickly required something, a separate offer, and that sort of, they were pulled in that direction. Now, on the other end, and sort of, you know, more complex, if you think in, you know, the extreme here, where you just got every, you know, a large number of different products or versions of products, and you've got a lot of different price points. Maybe you have different discount structures. Now you're in this world of complexity, and we talked to a number of Insight portfolio companies that live in this world right now. We were on a call this morning, and I won't tell you who they are, but it's a company that's growing great. They're having great success, but they're smart and they're being proactive and realizing they're getting feedback from the customers that their pricing, their products is too complex. They have too many. They're not bundled in ways that are thoughtful, and customers are having to spend a lot of time figuring out what the right solution was. And so this company is proactively thinking about how to simplify that offering structure and move somewhat more to the left, somewhere more in the middle there. So a couple things. As you think about that framework, what we're really trying to do, key point I want to make here when it comes to offering structure, is we know we have different segments out there that get different value from what we do. Okay? Now, there's two ways that value can be different. Okay? And this is what we're trying to align the value structure or the offering structure against. It can be different based on the amount of value. In other words, some customers get a lot of value, some smaller customers may get much less, or vice versa. But it can also be the type of value. So in other words, it may be that one company, that trading example I used, traders use this as a fundamental part of their business strategy. So as a very unique application, as opposed to companies who are using this product as more of a business planning tool and a reference tool. So very different applications. One of the solutions for that is not to change the price, but to come up with an offer that makes more sense, okay, for those customers. So those are the two key types of value difference. Now, there's three basic types of offer structures. The first is, and this is very common, many of you are doing this today, is you have product tiers. This is sort of the classic situation where I've got one major use case. Everybody is using the product in a similar way, not exactly the same, but that they get different value, different amounts of value, or they value different parts of the offer differently. So classic solution here is good, better, best, on 2 or 3 sort of tiers here. Great example there. Now, a lot of times you can't, if you're in a more of the one-size-fits-all offering, you can't easily break apart your product. But what is a common opportunity is being able to do service tiers. So tiering your services is something that, if service is an important revenue stream for you, is generally an excellent opportunity, creating low, medium, and high service tiers, much the same way we do with products. The third type of offer is fundamentally different, and this is what we call use case packages. And this is for offers that when we have customers with very different use cases. I'll show you in a minute an example from AutoCAD, where architects have a very different use case than a drafter. And so they created fundamentally different products bundles that sit on top of the core AutoCAD solution for those use cases. Okay, so here's 2 ways. These are the 3 tools or mechanisms we have for either starting with a simple product and creating opportunities to drive more volume and margin with some tiers or different bundles, or similarly, if we're at the overly complex, everything's unbundled world, some ways to think about getting back to a more structured approach. Now, I just want to show you a couple of examples here, just to give you a flavor. Again, most of you have seen this, and then I want to talk about some practical advice for how you do this. Here's one. Kronos is a great example of a company that has got a fantastic solution. The use cases are pretty similar regardless of the type of company, at least for their core solution. And then there's certain categories where the use cases are different. But for most companies, the core offering, it serves the same purpose. The problem is small to mid-sized companies tend to be less sophisticated, have less budget, and really don't have the ability to use all of the functionality of the offering. So they have a small to mid-sized business offering, and then they have a medium to large enterprise offering. So what's nice about that is customers can select in where they are, the value messaging can be consistent to what their needs are, and the pricing based on the offer can look the same. Now, so that's one example. So the question is, okay, got it, that's a simple example. We're kind of doing that today, or we're not sure. How do I get there? how do I get to a good, better, best product tier offer? Well, first thing, and it's funny, over the years we've made this a simpler process. But to get good, better, best is you don't need to make it overly sophisticated. Start with your core offer. Try to understand the value of your major features. That's sort of a basic fundamental step. And we sort of decompose the offer into its different component features. And then we start to say, hey, which of these features are either high value, or particularly if it's a service or some cost-driven function, high value or high cost, that we might want to take out of the economy offer and begin to create an economy offer. Similarly, on the other end, what are the high value features or improved table stakes features that are in the core offer? Are there improvements we can make to those features to begin to craft a premium offer? Now, that sounds awfully simple. In fact, so simple you'd say, gee, there's got to be a more sophisticated or smarter way to do this. But what we're really creating here is a hypothesis about what that good, better, best offer structure might look like. And then rather than overinvest in analyzing the front end, what we do is test on the back end. We can do some market research, share it with customers, lots of ways to get feedback, and that's something we're going to want to do. And then we use the feedback to iterate and sort of refine, and then we'll ultimately build a business case and try to understand and really estimate the impact of the different offering structure. So that's sort of the basic, the basics there. On the use case, this is that AutoCAD example. So that was the good, better, best version for product tiers or service tiers. On the AutoCAD example here, this is just the point I was making earlier, which is they've got very clearly defined packages for, depending on the use case, civil engineering, 3D, architecture, mapping, electrical. And so what it does is simplify the sales process, clarifies the messaging, and it gives them very clear value. They can do very clear value-based pricing and get the price right and create some discrimination. You can well imagine if this was just, and years ago, AutoCAD was more this way, you can well imagine that this would be a nightmare for a customer to navigate if they just had a punch list of all these different things that they could choose from. So that's sort of the notion. It's very simple. A couple of questions you want to think about is if you're stepping back, and one thing you can do is think about that spectrum, simple to complex. Where do you fall? Are you in the middle? Are you at the end, on the right-hand side, on the left-hand side? If you're thinking about the good, better, best option, not the use case scenario, but if you're thinking about the good, better, best option, how many is too many, and where do you draw the line? So what's better, 2, 3, or 4 tiers? The answer is it depends, but there is a rule of thumb here that you can use, and it's generally a very good rule of thumb. The tension we're trying to manage is we'd like more complexity. We want to move to if we have a one-size-fits-all offer, we'd love to move to a more complex offering. But if we go beyond 3, the way human brains work, it makes it much harder for people to process, and they start to struggle. So 3 becomes kind of a tipping point for how difficult it is for people to evaluate those offers. So typically we end up at 2 or 3 versions, and again, this is where if you have largely a single use case opportunity. Now, you can if it's a multiple use case situation, you can have more than 4. That's not a problem because people will opt into where they want to be, and now it's a much simpler decision process. A couple other quick questions, and then we'll throw it open and see if you have any others, any other questions, and then I'll turn it over to Rachel to do a couple quick closing questions. One is, should I conduct market research tests? Generally, yes, but generally not very sophisticated. So, for example, if you're thinking about changing the offering structure, at the very least, you can go to customers and get some qualitative feedback. If it's a major change, you may want to do a little more work, but it's not an essential. You don't necessarily have to do a huge market research study, a conjoint study or something. Speaking of conjoint study, is it worth the expense? It can be. It can be a very important tool for uncovering customers' true preferences, but it can be time-consuming. It can be expensive. And if it's a very complicated study, it takes some real expertise to do them right. And so you have to be a little wary of who you're working with and make sure you're working with somebody who really knows what they're doing. So let me, at this point, I've been talking fast, getting through it. I'm going to save a few minutes for any questions for the company. So Rachel, I'll throw it back over to you and see if you have that, and then you can wrap us up for the hour.
Thanks, John. So one more question actually from the previous section, and then I'll get to the questions from this section.
Okay.
We got one question around price decreases. So, if you're getting market feedback that your product is more expensive than your competition, what are the steps that you should take?
Great question. The first question is, let's understand where that feedback is coming from. One of the things we have to be wary of is let's understand, is this coming from procurement, for example, who is trained to tell us that our prices are too expensive? So let's kind of validate the quality of that data, but that input. One of the number one thing, been doing this for a long time, the first place we go is do a quick value model. If you've built a value proposition for this customer, let's see, for this customer, let's see if we can customize that up. It's not a big effort. You can do it relatively quickly. But the number one, the most solid metric you can use is say, hey, here's how much value we think this customer is getting. They're telling us our price is too high relative to the competition. If you see, you do that value calculation, you find yourself well above in the upper realm of that net differential value, you know what? You might be priced too high.
Okay, that's great. Thanks, John. So another question, actually, which I'll take, and then feel free to chime in if you have anything to add, which is, how do you get support from your board and investors to change pricing? I think actually a lot of the analytics that John is talking about on this call are the perfect place to start in terms of providing a data-driven view of why you think a pricing change is the right way to go, and in support for pricing changes that you as a management team have already decided are the right move. John, I don't know if you have anything else to add there.
No, I think, what we're trying to do, one of the challenges of pricing is that it can become almost an emotional discussion, and people have points of view that aren't always backed up with data. The most powerful thing we can do is sort out what's really going on, bring some data, bring some analytics to the table, and as much as possible, let's talk about fact as opposed to opinion. And, at the end, that's the most you can hope for.
Thanks, totally agree. So one other question about offer structure. What is the benefit that you usually see in the companies that you're working with, and how do you measure that impact?
Yeah, it's a great question. If you think about, there's two types of opportunities in offering structure. Let's suppose I'll just use this as an example, but we're going from more of a one-size-fits-all offer, and we're creating a set of tiered offers. There's two ways you're going to see benefit from that. One is that the low-value segments, you should see additional revenues. You should see conversion analytics go up because now you have an offer that makes sense to those low-value customers. At the high end, what we should be able to do is drive, if we're pricing appropriately, once we create the offers, we should be driving higher margins. So it's creating an offering structure, getting the offering structure right is a little bit like the magic pricing pixie dust. It can give us greater volume and greater margins at the same time. That's pretty good stuff. So one of the things you're looking at is we have seen one financial advisory, very large, well-known financial data and advisory company started moving towards a upper tier premium price solution. And so they had their base solution. They were really creating the premium offer, and what they saw was an uptick of around 30% in pricing and the margins that they were getting. It was a significant uptick, and it wasn't so much about volume, but it was actually getting more margin for them. And so if you get it right, the benefit is, out of all the things we've talked about, the benefit can be the greatest of all those 5 examples.
Yeah, and totally agree with that in terms of how much pricing can have an impact on EBITDA. One additional question is around customer support, and if your features are similar, but the support and overall customer experience is dramatically superior to the competition, how do you translate that into better pricing?
Well, a couple ways. I would go back. There's a couple of opportunities there. One of the things is when you're going in and talking to customers or talking to procurement, it's a kind of a hard conversation. It's like, well, we got better support, and their answer is typically going to be, that's nice, thank you very much. So one of the things we can do is begin to quantify that and say, build a value model that says, here's what this is worth to you. We're saving you, X hours of time, or keeping your operational, and minimizing downtime, or we are helping you drive additional revenue. So one thing we can do is we can quantify that. The other thing is on support offers, anything related to support and service, what we typically find is that there's a wide variety of need, and if there's a wide variety of need or usage, there's usually a wide variety of value. And so one of the things that is an opportunity there is to create some kind of tiers there, and that enables you, gives sales some flexibility, saying, hey, price is too much here, guess what? We can get price down by moving to a lower support tier, that may be more automated, et cetera. So all the tools that we've talked about can come into play around support. You just have to, sort of suss out the situation and see where the best opportunities are.
Great, thanks, John. I think we're getting close to the time, so if you can just move to our last slide. So in closing, we wanted to just leave everyone here with a few thoughts, because we've talked about a lot of different topics here. Some of them are longer term initiatives for your business. So what are the things that you can do immediately? The first one is annual prices increases to your existing customers. So we at Insight believe that you should be targeting an average of a 5% annual price increase as a minimum. Now this is an average, so some customers might be getting slightly less than that and some will be getting more. And we have some portfolio companies that have been successful in rolling out much greater than 5% annual increases across the board. And I think the most important thing is, as John mentioned earlier in the call, you can and should be selectively aggressive where customers can bear it, and you'll see a huge impact to your bottom line. The second thing I would say is just to start to take a look at your offering and segmentation strategy and see where do you fall on the offer spectrum in terms of level of complexity. And while there is definitely complexity in actually making changes and managing changes to your offer structure, the frameworks we discussed today are the right place to start to evaluate where you stand. So with that, I just want to thank John so much for your insights, and to everyone on the call for taking an hour out of your day to join us. We will make the slides available, and we will also follow up with a survey to get your feedback and also areas where you would like further help. So we would greatly appreciate if you can fill that out. And thank you again.
Thank you, everyone.